Each legislative session, MDDEMS introduced new bills aimed at protecting criminals while neglecting those they harm. These Maryland liberals assert moral superiority and persuade residents that they are acting with integrity. However, they implement questionable laws that primarily benefit their activist supporters, which undermines public safety. This year's iteration of the status quo in Annapolis is the Youth Charging Reform Act. This bill has successfully passed both chambers of the General Assembly and is now poised for final approval from the governor. The Youth Charging Reform Act, also known as the Removal of Accountability for Youth Offenders Act, changes 3 fundamental rules regarding Maryland's courts and judicial proceedings articles, and that which of those that are related to laws for juvenile offenders. The bill changes which youth could be charged as adults and raises the youngest age from 14 to 16. 14 and 15-year-olds can be charged as adults for first-degree murder. However, 16-year-olds charged with first-degree assault and firearm offenses will be sent to juvenile court. According to MD Code 3-202, first-degree assault is defined as serious physical injury that causes permanent damage, strangulation, and offenses committed with a firearm. Therefore, if a youth offender strangles a woman, pistol whips her in the eye, and causes her to become permanently blind in that eye, this youth will not be charged as an adult. Detention for youth offenders also sees some changes. Detention for misdemeanors or younger children is more restricted. Offenders under the age of 13 face extra limits on detention for gun and firearm cases. No child, even one that is charged or convicted in adult court, may be detained or confined in any facility where they have any contact with adult inmates. Temporary holds in adult facilities are allowed only for processing caps up to 6 hours if there are no other juvenile facilities or spaces that are available. Supporters of this legislation, including Senator Will Smith from Silver Spring, argue that 85% of youth tried as adults ultimately return to juvenile court. They further assert that juvenile courts and detention facilities prioritize rehabilitation rather than punitive measures found in adult courts and detention facilities. They contend that this approach is evidence-based and effectively addresses the racial disparities among youths charged as adults. They also assert that this will lower recidivism. The problem is that this position lacks nuance and fails to address the structural issues within the Department of Juvenile Services. It does not include a comprehensive strategy to deter crime on a broader scale and undermines the automatic accountability measures for violent juvenile offenders who repeatedly recidivate. From 2022 to 2024, total complaints from juvenile crime have increased by 14%. Crimes of violence from youth offenders increased by 58% in 2024. Carjacking complaints by youth offenders increased by 84% from 2020 to 2023. Handgun violations involving youth offenders increased by 220% from 2020 to 2023. Auto theft increased by 64% during the same period. Initiating cases for violent offenders in juvenile court at this time is undeniably regressive. Given the rise in violent juvenile crime in Maryland and ongoing institutional failures, the juvenile justice system currently lacks the capacity to handle additional cases. The Office of Legislative Audits conducted a report that shows strong failures in DJS. Detainees suffered from deplorable conditions where they lived among rats and mice, ate unsanitary food, and were subjected to rape or sexual assault. Maryland faces a minimum of $5 billion in liability from 12,000 child sexual abuse claims filed under the state's Child Victims Act, with many targeting the Department of Juvenile Services. DJS has many operational failures. These issues have persisted for decades, and there haven't been any substantive measures to address them. There are inadequate screening and background checks for new staff. There's a 17% vacancy rate in the correctional facilities. Maryland uses an outdated system called the Assist database that doesn't track accurate recidivism rates, and the department has no systems in place that provide robust services. The department relies on an outdated intake system and uses GPS ankle monitoring systems, which research has shows that they're ineffective. The advocates for social justice in Annapolis need to engage with me if they genuinely care about addressing juvenile crime, recidivism, and disparities faced by youth who are charged as adults. First and foremost, we must enact laws that address the underlying causes of crime and promote effective deterrent strategies. The root cause of juvenile crime comes from the lack of supervision. We need boarding school type settings for at-risk youth since their parents have abdicated their responsibilities to supervise their children. Maryland must mandate full implementation of audit and Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability recommendations with legislative reporting and penalties. Maryland needs to ensure that the Commission on Juvenile Justice Reform has subpoena power, dedicated funding sources, and authority to issue binding recommendations on facilities, equity, and service gaps. We need to strengthen the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit or create an ombudsman with enforcement authority over facilities, including unannounced inspections and public dashboards on compliance. The state must enforce stringent, continuous background checks and alerts for all staffs and contractors. Additionally, it should tighten procurement laws, upgrade data systems, and establish minimum facility standards. Lastly, Maryland has closed down 4 facilities that are used for juvenile justice, including Alfred D. Noyes Children's Center located in Montgomery County. It seems that policymakers have taken note of my suggestions last year, which advocated for repurposing these facilities into rehabilitation centers. If elected, I will work to ensure that these facilities are effectively transformed into rehab centers and vocational learning institutions.